The morning Wren Beaumont signed the lease on her first international flagship store, a courier arrived at her hotel with a bouquet of white peonies and a note in handwriting so careful it looked as if it had been engraved. She would spend the rest of her life wondering whether a man capable of forging that much tenderness had ever, even once, meant a single word of it. She stood in the empty shell of the boutique that afternoon, sunlight slanting through bare windows onto polished concrete that still smelled of fresh paint, and let herself believe, for one entire unguarded hour, that everything she had built from a rented kitchen in Charleston to this address in the heart of Gangnam had finally, irreversibly, arrived. She did not yet know that the man who had made this moment possible, the man whose signature sat beside hers on every contract binding her company to his capital, did not exist. Not the version of him she had fallen for, anyway. That man was an invention, assembled with the same obsessive attention to detail Wren gave her rarest fragrances, and she had trusted him completely. If you love stories where love and deception wear the same face, where a woman has to decide whether her own instincts can be trusted after everything they once got wrong, stay with this story until the very end. And if this is your first time here, subscribe and turn on notifications, because what Wren discovers next will make you question every charming man who's ever seemed too good to be true. 8 months earlier, Wren had been drowning quietly in the particular way small business owners drown: a beautiful product, a growing following, and a bank account that could not stretch fast enough to meet either. Her fragrance house, built on the memory of her grandmother's Charleston perfumery and the ashes of a family business that had collapsed when Wren was 19, victim to a predatory loan she had watched her father sign in good faith and lose everything to anyway, had finally caught the attention of an international retailer, an opportunity that required capital Wren did not have and could not, after her family's history, bring herself to borrow from a bank. Her father had trusted a smiling man named Ellis Cordray, a regional loan officer who had taken him to dinner twice, remembered the names of Wren's siblings, and structured a business loan so aggressively predatory that within 3 years the family perfumery, 4 generations old, had been sold at auction to cover interest payments that had somehow never once decreased despite every payment made on time. Wren had been 19, home from her first year of chemistry courses, and had watched her father sit at the kitchen table with his head in his hands the night the final notice arrived, a man who had never once raised his voice in her presence, undone entirely by a stranger's careful charm. She had sworn to herself, packing her things to return to school 2 weeks later, that she would rebuild everything her family had lost, and that she would never again let a smiling man's attention cloud her judgment about where money truly came from. It was a promise she had kept for 12 years, through every negotiation, every partnership offer, every well-dressed man who complimented her nose for scent before asking about her valuation. She had built her fragrance house slowly, stubbornly, on her own terms, refusing 3 previous investment offers that came with strings she didn't trust, and told herself, each time she said no, that she was honoring her father's memory by refusing to repeat his mistake. She did not yet understand that the mistake was never trusting too quickly. It was believed that 12 years of caution made her immune to a man patient enough to spend 8 months earning it properly. She met Seo Yul at an industry showcase in New York, where he introduced himself as an independent angel investor with a portfolio of boutique luxury brands across Asia, softly spoken, unhurried, the kind of attention that felt, in the moment, like the opposite of every predatory thing she had learned to fear. He asked about her grandmother's original formulas before he asked about her margins. He remembered, 3 weeks later at a follow-up dinner, the exact story she had told him about the scent of gardenia reminding her of her grandmother's porch, and had a private blend of gardenia and something warmer, something like sun on cedar, sent to her hotel room the next morning with no note attached, as though the gesture were meant to speak for itself. It did. Wren, who had spent a decade building careful walls around exactly this kind of vulnerability, felt one of them quietly give way. "You don't strike me as a man who does anything without calculating the return," she told him once, only half teasing, over dinner in a private room overlooking the Han River, the city's lights strung out beneath them as something poured rather than built. Seo Yul had smiled, the particular smile she would later understand had been rehearsed in some form for years, warm at the edges, careful at the center. "Some investments aren't about return," he said. Some are simply about recognizing something rare before the rest of the world catches up. He had reached for her hand across the table then, and she had let him take it, and told herself the fluttering in her chest was only excitement about the deal. He courted her over the following weeks with the specific and relentless generosity of a man who understood that Wren's guardedness was not a wall to be argued down, but a language to be learned, patiently, in its own dialect. He never pushed. He never rushed a single conversation about the future, never asked prying questions about her family's bankruptcy beyond what she volunteered on her own. And when she finally did tell him, late one evening in her small rented apartment, about the loan officer who had smiled at her father twice over dinner before destroying 4 generations of work, Seo Yul had listened without a single interruption. And then, quietly, told her that he understood exactly what it cost to watch someone you loved undone by a man's careful charm, that his own family had lost something similar once, years ago, in a story he still found too painful to tell in full. It was, she would understand months later, the single most effective sentence he ever said to her, a wound offered specifically to mirror her own, engineered to make her trust feel less like a risk and more like recognition, 2 survivors finding each other across an ocean. She fell for him slowly, and then, in the way these things happen, all at once, somewhere between a dinner where he memorized her coffee order without being told twice, and a quiet Sunday morning when he brought her breakfast from a bakery 3 neighborhoods away because she'd once mentioned, in passing, missing the specific taste of her grandmother's biscuits. She would spend the weeks after his arrest trying to determine which of those gestures had been genuine affection wearing the shape of strategy, and which had simply been strategy wearing the shape of affection, and would eventually, painfully, arrive at the understanding that with a man like Young Ho Jae, the two had never been separable at all. Dahlia Ri, a Korean-American sommelier Wren had met through a mutual friend in her first month in Seoul, and who had appointed herself, with characteristic bluntness, Wren's unofficial guardian against bad decisions, was considerably less charmed. He remembered your grandmother's porch, Dahlia said, swirling wine she had no intention of drinking during their conversation, studying Wren over the rim of the glass with narrowed, affectionate suspicion. Men who remember that much detail, that fast, are either genuinely in love or building a very specific kind of trust with you. I've seen both. They look identical from across a dinner table. He's funding my entire flagship store, Dahlia. That's not romance, that's business. It's both. And you know it's both, which is exactly why I'm worried. Dahlia set the glass down. What do you actually know about where his money comes from? Wren didn't have a real answer, and the fact that she didn't have a real answer bothered her more than she let Dahlia see. She tried, in the weeks that followed, to find one. She asked Seo Yul over a series of dinners that always seemed to end with the topic gently redirected before she got a full picture about his own background, and received, each time, a story polished enough to satisfy without ever quite adding up to a complete shape. He told her he had built his early capital trading commodities in his 20s, that his family had been modest, that he preferred not to discuss his childhood in detail because it had been, in his words, a difficult one he had worked hard to leave behind. It was, she would understand much later, a masterclass in giving just enough vulnerability to discourage further questions, a wound offered instead of an answer, and it had worked on her exactly as it was designed to. He said his childhood was difficult, she told Dahlia, some weeks into the courtship, half defending him even as some quiet, unacknowledged part of her flagged the deflection. I didn't want to push. I know what it's like to not want to talk about the worst years of your life to someone you've just met. There's a difference between not wanting to relive pain and never once landing on a single verifiable fact, Dahlia said, gently but without backing down. I'm not telling you not to fall for him. I'm telling you to keep at least one eye open while you do. Wren told herself she was keeping both eyes open. She would spend months afterward understanding exactly how thoroughly she had not been. Seo Yul took her, one unseasonably warm evening in her 4th month in Seoul, to the top of Namsan Tower. timing their arrival precisely so the city spread out beneath them just as the sun dropped fully behind the western ridgeline, the kind of orchestrated perfection she would later recognize as one more carefully engineered detail in a courtship built entirely of them. He had a small velvet box in his coat pocket that evening. Not a ring, he was careful to clarify with a laugh when she stiffened slightly at the sight of it, but a vintage perfume atomizer he'd found at an estate sale in Paris, engraved with her initials, a gift so specific and so thoughtful that she had cried a little, right there at the railing, and let him wipe the tears away with his thumb while a stranger's camera flash went off somewhere behind them, capturing a moment neither of them yet understood would later be entered into evidence. It was on the walk back down, weaving through the quieter paths below the tower, that a woman Wren had never seen before fell into step beside her for a few unsettling seconds, close enough to speak without being overheard, far enough that Seo Yul, several paces ahead, checking something on his phone, didn't notice the exchange at all. "Ask him about Vancouver," the woman said, low and fast, her accent unplaceable, her eyes fixed straight ahead as though she were speaking to no one at all. "Ask him what happened to the money in Vancouver." Before Wren could fully process the words, let alone respond, the woman had peeled away into the crowd descending the mountain path, gone as quickly and inexplicably as she'd appeared, leaving Wren standing frozen for a moment before Seo Yul turned back, smiling, asking if she was all right. "Fine," Wren said, the lie coming easier than it should have. "Just tired." She told herself, walking the rest of the way down beside him, that it had been a stranger, confused, perhaps mistaking her for someone else entirely, a coincidence too strange to mean anything at all. She did not tell him about the woman. She did not, for 3 more days, tell anyone, turning the word Vancouver over in her mind at odd hours, a splinter she couldn't quite work free until a wire transfer she hadn't authorized gave the splinter a shape she could no longer ignore. The contracts, when they finally arrived, were dense and international, routed through a holding entity registered in Hong Kong that Seo Yul explained, with the easy fluency of a man who had explained it many times before, existed purely for tax efficiency, a structure his lawyers insisted on for every deal above a certain size. Wren's own attorney in the United States, overworked and unfamiliar with cross-border investment structures, reviewed the documents in a single rushed afternoon and found nothing that alarmed him enough to delay a deal Wren was, by then, emotionally as well as financially committed to closing. Han Tae Sung noticed the same holding entity 11 days before Wren ever signed a single page, though for entirely different reasons, and had already spent 4 months building a file on it thick enough to need its own drawer. If you're enjoying how this story is unfolding, take a moment to subscribe. It genuinely helps us bring you more unforgettable mysteries every week and stay close, because the man investigating Wren's investor is about to walk directly into her life, and neither of them yet understands how much they're going to need each other before this is over. Tae Sung had built his career as an independent forensic auditor specifically because he no longer trusted institutions to move fast enough to stop men like the one he was now tracking. Years earlier, a fund manager operating under a different but equally invented name had persuaded Tae Sung's older sister to invest her entire savings, along with the pooled retirement funds of 9 of her closest friends, into a boutique venture fund that turned out to be an elaborate structure for laundering money stolen from a previous, unrelated scheme. The fund manager had vanished 11 days after the money cleared. Tae Sung's sister had not recovered, not financially, and, in the years since, not entirely in any other sense either. She had stopped attending family gatherings for nearly 2 years afterward, ashamed in a way Tae Sung had never fully been able to talk her out of, convinced that her own gullibility, rather than the fund manager's calculated cruelty, was the true cause of what had happened to her friend's money. Tae Sung had sat with her many nights in that period, watching a formerly confident, quick-witted woman flinch at the mention of investments, and had promised her, quietly, that he would find the man responsible if it took the rest of his life. He had left a stable position at a major accounting firm within the year and had spent the better part of a decade since hunting exactly this kind of man with a patience that had cost him, by his own quiet admission, most of his personal life along the way, including, 2 years earlier, a long relationship that had finally ended when his partner told him, not unkindly, that she had grown tired of competing with a ghost he had never met. The Hong Kong holding entity behind Seo Yul's investment in Wren's company shared a registered agent with two previous funds Tae Sung had already traced to fraud, one in Singapore, one in Vancouver. Both collapsed within 18 months of their founding, both leaving investors with nothing but paperwork and a name that, in each case, turned out to belong to no verifiable person at all. Tae Sung arrived in Seoul the week Wren signed her lease, introduced himself to her at an investor mixer as a potential franchise partner interested in expanding her brand into department store concessions, and spent the entire conversation watching her with the careful, unreadable attention of a man deciding whether the woman in front of him was a victim or a partner in the scheme he had spent months building a case against. "You seem very informed about my supply chain for someone interested in retail concessions," Wren said, midway through their second meeting, an edge of genuine suspicion creeping into her voice for the first time since she'd met him. "I like to understand what I'm investing in," Tae Sung said, which was true in a way she would not understand the full weight of for several more weeks. The first real crack appeared 3 weeks later, in the shape of a wire transfer Wren had not authorized. $40,000 moved from her company's operating account to a supplier in Busan she had never contracted with, discovered only because her bookkeeper flagged an unfamiliar recurring line item during a routine reconciliation. Wren brought it to Seo Yul directly, expecting an easy explanation, the kind he always had ready, and received one, smooth and immediate. Something about a raw materials broker he had personally vetted to secure a better price on rare oud, a business decision made on her behalf that he apologized, charmingly, for not running past her first. She believed him. She would spend weeks afterward turning that decision over in her mind like a stone she couldn't stop touching, trying to understand how a woman who had once watched her own father lose everything to a smiling man's easy explanations could walk directly into the same trap with her eyes fully open, simply because this time the smiling man had also learned the smell of her grandmother's porch. The next crack came from somewhere Wren least expected, her own hands. Retrieving a scarf from the coat Seo Yul had left draped over a chair during a rare, unguarded evening at her apartment, her fingers caught on something stiff in the interior pocket, a slim leather case she assumed, at first, held business cards. Inside, instead, she found a passport, deep blue, worn at the corners in a way his usual polished appearance never was, and a name printed beneath a photograph that was unmistakably his face. Younger, harder around the eyes, a name that was not Seo Yul at all. She stood frozen in her own hallway for a long moment, the passport heavy in her hand, before the sound of running water from her bathroom, him humming something under his breath, sent her heart lurching into a rhythm she didn't recognize. She told herself, sliding the passport back into its case with hands that would not quite stop shaking, that there had to be an explanation, a legal name change, a dual identity tied to some tax structure his lawyers had mentioned once in passing. She wanted badly for there to be an explanation, and it was that wanting, more than any genuine belief, that let her walk back into the living room minutes later and kiss him hello, as though her entire understanding of him had not just quietly cracked down the middle. She did not tell Dahlia about the passport that night. She did not, in fact, tell anyone, turning the discovery over alone for 3 sleepless days, caught between the terror of being right and the deeper, more familiar terror of being made a fool of twice by her own instincts, once for missing a threat and once for imagining one that wasn't there. It was, in the end, Bianca Reyes's interrogation that finally forced her hand, because a woman who had spent 3 days protecting a stranger's secret out of fear could no longer justify staying silent while someone innocent paid for it. Bianca Reyes, Wren's shop manager, became the first casualty of the growing unease, questioned quietly by investigator Young Hae Il after financial records tied to the Busan transfer appeared, briefly and inexplicably, to have been accessed from Bianca's company laptop during off hours. Bianca, 26 and terrified, wept through the entire interview, insisting she had left her laptop unlocked at the shop overnight during a delivery, a detail Young noted with professional skepticism but could neither immediately confirm nor dismiss. Wren, watching her shop manager's composure crack in the back office afterward, felt something cold settle into her stomach that had nothing to do with Bianca's guilt and everything to do with the growing, unbearable suspicion that someone far closer to her than a nervous 26-year-old had engineered the entire trail. It was Tae Sung, 3 days later, who confirmed what Wren had already begun to fear without letting herself fully believe it. He requested a meeting under the pretense of finalizing concession terms and instead laid a single photograph on the table between them, a grainy but unmistakable image pulled from a Vancouver Business Registry filing. A man in a different suit, a different haircut, standing beside a different woman at a different launch event 4 years earlier, introduced in the caption beneath the image not as Seo Yul, but as a name Wren had already seen once before, alone, in a hallway, with a stranger's passport shaking in her hand. "His real name is Young Ho Jae," Tae Sung said quietly, watching her face for the moment the ground gave way beneath her, and was visibly caught off guard when the ground, instead, simply held, her expression tightening into something closer to grim confirmation than shock. "You already knew," he said, slower. "I found a passport in his coat 3 days ago." Her voice was steady, though it cost her something to keep it that way. "I told myself there had to be an innocent explanation. I have spent 3 days telling myself that." Tae Sung studied her for a long moment, something in his posture recalibrating, the wariness he'd carried into the room easing, incrementally, into something closer to respect. "There isn't one," he said. "Seo Yul doesn't exist. He never did." Wren stared at the photograph for a long time before she trusted her own voice enough to speak. "You've known this the entire time we've been talking about department stores." "I've known it since before I ever walked into that mixer." Tae Sung's jaw was tight, his voice low, careful, a man choosing every word with the precision of someone who understood exactly how much damage the wrong ones could do. "I came to Seoul to build a case against him, Miss Beaumont. I did not come here to fall into the middle of someone else's heartbreak. But I need you to understand something, and I need you to hear it without deciding I'm only saying it to manage you the way he has. You are not the first woman he's done this to. You will not be the last unless someone stops him, and right now, you are the only person close enough to him to help me do that." The word victim landed on Wren like a slap she hadn't braced for, not because it was cruel, but because some proud, wounded part of her had spent 8 months insisting to herself that she, of all people, the daughter of a man destroyed by exactly this kind of confidence trick, could never fall for the same lie twice. "I need you to understand something, too," she said finally, her voice steady in a way that surprised them both. "If you think I'm going to sit quietly while you build your case around me like I'm a piece of evidence instead of a person, you don't know me at all. I want him exposed. I want it more than you do, because he didn't just take my money. He took 8 months I will never get back, believing something that was never real." She met Tae Sung's eyes directly. "So tell me exactly what you need, and I will decide, myself, how much of it I'm willing to give." Something in Tae Sung's expression shifted then, a recalibration she would only understand much later, as the precise moment he stopped seeing her as a variable in his investigation and started seeing her as a person he very much did not want to see hurt any further. In the days that followed, their meetings, ostensibly still about concession terms and shared evidence, began to stretch longer than either strictly required, conversations drifting from financial statements into smaller, quieter territory neither of them had planned for. He found her, one evening, alone in the flagship store after hours, sitting on the unfinished floor surrounded by sample vials, testing a new blend she said she couldn't finish because grief kept getting into the notes, no matter how she adjusted the formula. He sat down across from her without being asked and listened while she talked, not about Seo Yul, but about her grandmother, about the particular quality of Charleston humidity that made certain resins bloom differently than they did anywhere else, about the 4 generations of women who had built something out of nothing before a man's smile had nearly taken it all away twice. Wren looked at him then, really looked, the way she hadn't quite let herself since the photograph on the table had rearranged everything she thought she understood. "Why does this matter so much to you? The case, I mean. You could have built it and handed it to Young and walked away by now. You didn't have to keep coming back here." Tae Sung was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. "Because every time I close one of these cases, I imagine it's the conversation I never got to have with my sister before it happened to her. I imagine getting there in time, just once." He held her gaze. "I don't only mean the case, Wren." She didn't have an answer ready for that. And for once, in 8 months of careful, curated courtship with another man, The absence of a rehearsed reply felt like the truest thing anyone had said to her in a very long time. There were nights, in the weeks that followed, when the weight of what she now knew threatened to collapse into something closer to paralysis than resolve. Evenings she called Tae Sung, not because Young's investigation required it, but simply because the silence of her apartment had become unbearable, filled as it was with the ghost of a man who had never actually existed there. He never once made her feel foolish for needing to talk it through again. The timeline, the gifts, which moments might have been real, which had certainly not been. He would sit on the other end of the line, sometimes for over an hour, saying very little, letting her work through it at her own pace, and it was in those quiet, unglamorous hours, far more than in any dramatic confrontation, that Wren first understood the particular safety of being genuinely, patiently seen. Dahlia, when Wren finally told her everything, the passport, the fake name, the wire she would soon agree to wear, did not say "I told you so," though she had more than earned the right to. She only pulled Wren into a fierce, wordless hug that lasted considerably longer than either of them was used to, and then, pulling back, held her by the shoulders with the particular sternness of a friend who intends to be obeyed. "You are going to let Young's people do their job," Dahlia said. "You are not going to play hero in a room alone with that man without a plan. Do you understand me? I have buried enough grief in my life. I am not burying you over a man who was never even real." "I promise," Wren said, and meant it, though the promise would be tested more than either of them anticipated in the weeks ahead. Investigator Han Tae Sung, brought fully into the case once Tae Sung's evidence made clear the scale of what they were dealing with, remained, initially, unconvinced of Wren's full innocence. A skepticism born less of any specific evidence against her than of 2 decades investigating financial fraud, during which he had learned that the line between victim and willing accomplice was very often drawn. Less by facts than by which version of events a woman was clever enough to construct after the fact. "You had access to every account," Young told her plainly, "in an interview room that smelled faintly of instant coffee and old carpet, and you signed contracts routing significant capital through an entity you never once independently verified." "I am not accusing you, Miss Beaumont. I am telling you how this looks to anyone who did not spend 8 months watching him send you flowers." Wren met his gaze without flinching, though something in her chest had gone tight and cold. "I signed those contracts because I trusted a man who spent 8 months making sure I had every reason to. I didn't grow up rich, investigator. I grew up watching my own father lose a 4-generation business to a man exactly like this one, and I swore I would never let it happen to me. It happened anyway, because he was patient enough to make it not look like the thing I was watching for." She drew a breath. "If you think that makes me a fool, you're not wrong. It doesn't make me his accomplice." Young was quiet for a long moment, his pen still against the notepad in front of him. "Fool and accomplice are not the same word," he said finally, something in his clipped tone softening by a small but perceptible degree. "I intend to find out for certain which one you are before this goes any further. I would advise you to want that as much as I do." "I do," Wren said. "More." "Then let me help you, help us prove it," she added a moment later, and Young, after a long, measuring silence, finally nodded. What followed was the most dangerous and delicate month of Wren's life. A slow, deliberate performance in which she continued meeting Seo Yul, continued smiling across dinner tables and signing documents he brought her. All of it now carefully monitored, timed, and recorded under Young's direction, every warm gesture from a man she now understood to be entirely constructed, costing her something she wasn't certain she'd ever fully get back even after the case was closed. Seo Yul, unaware his real name and history had been laid bare, grew bolder rather than more careful, a pattern Tae Sung recognized from every previous scheme, the fatal overconfidence of a man who had never once been caught and had stopped believing he could be. He proposed, during their third-to-last dinner together, that Wren allow him to expand his investment into a controlling stake, framing it as a partnership deepening into something permanent, both financially and, he said, taking her hand across the table with the same rehearsed warmth he had used from the very beginning, personally. "I've never wanted to build something with someone the way I want to build this with you. he said, and Wren, who had spent a month learning to keep her face perfectly still while recording devices captured every word, felt something almost like grief for the version of this moment she had once genuinely wanted. "I need to think about the controlling stake," she told him, and meant, though he would never understand it until it was far too late, something entirely different than what he believed. The scheme's true shape finally emerged 3 days later, when Young's financial crimes team, cross-referencing the Busan supplier transfer against export manifests, discovered that the raw materials broker Seo Yul had personally vetted did not exist as a functioning business at all, existing only as a shell used to route laundered funds from his previous, collapsing Vancouver scheme through Wren's. Legitimate export shipments, disguising dirty money as the ordinary cost of doing business inside crates of her own perfume oils bound, ultimately for resale through a legitimate luxury retailer in Singapore, an arrangement that would have made Wren's own company, without her knowledge, the unwitting engine cleaning the very fraud that had funded her flagship store in the first place. "He wasn't only investing in me," Wren said quietly, staring at the shipment manifests spread across Tae Sung's desk at 2 in the morning, the full architecture of it finally visible all at once. "He built my dream specifically because it was the perfect place to hide what he was already stealing." Chairman No Sung-min, a legitimate and considerably more cautious investor, Seo Yul, had begun courting as his next major target during the final weeks of his scheme with Wren, unknowingly became the crack that finally broke the entire structure open. No, wealthy enough to have survived 2 previous economic collapses through sheer institutional paranoia, insisted on an independent audit of the Hong Kong holding entity before committing any capital, an audit that, once underway, moved with a scale and official backing Tae Sung's 4 years of solo investigation had never been able to command. No had met Wren only once, briefly, at the same investor mixer where Tae Sung had first introduced himself and had left the encounter. He told Young's investigators later, with a quiet, nagging unease he hadn't been able to name at the time, something about the way Seo Yul spoke over her when she tried to explain her own formulas, finishing her sentences with a warmth that, on reflection, looked considerably more like control than partnership. It was a small observation, offered almost as an afterthought during an unrelated interview, but it confirmed for Young something Wren herself had not yet fully articulated even to Tae Sung, that the 8 months she had spent believing herself an equal partner in the relationship had, in fact, been 8 months of being quietly, methodically managed. Seo Yul, sensing for the first time in his career that the ground beneath him had genuinely shifted, began quietly liquidating assets and preparing, Tae Sung's sources confirmed with mounting urgency, to leave the country within the week. Wren learned of the timeline the same evening she was meant to attend what Seo Yul had framed as a small, private celebration of their expanded partnership, a dinner she now understood, with sick clarity, was designed to secure her signature on the controlling stake documents before he vanished entirely, documents that would have left her legally exposed to the full weight of his fraud the moment investigators came looking for someone still standing in Seoul. "You don't have to go tonight," Tae Sung told her, standing in the doorway of the small apartment she'd been staying in since the case began, his voice low and urgent in a way that had nothing to do with procedure and everything to do with the fact that somewhere in the last month, without either of them quite admitting it, he had stopped being able to think of her only as a witness. "Jung has enough now to move without you walking back into a room with him. He'll run the moment he suspects something's wrong, and you'll spend another 4 years chasing a new name in a new country," Wren said. "I've spent 8 months being the woman he fooled. I would like, for once, to be the reason he finally gets caught." She studied Tae Sung's face for a long moment, searching for whatever it was she needed to see there before she could walk out that door. "Tell me you trust me to do this." "I trust you," he said, and it was, she realized, the first time in a year that a man's trust in her had felt like something solid enough to actually stand on. The dinner took place in a private dining room on the top floor of a hotel overlooking the Han River. The same view, Wren noted with a bitterness she kept carefully hidden behind a practiced smile, as the night he had first taken her hand across a table and told her some investments weren't about return at all. Investigator Young's team had the building's exits covered within the hour, plainclothes officers positioned in the lobby, the kitchen corridor, the private elevator bank, while Tae Sung waited in a surveillance van 2 floors below, listening to the wire Wren had agreed, after considerable argument, to wear against her skin beneath a dress the color of the gardenia blend Seo Yul had once sent her without. A note, an irony she had chosen deliberately, a small, private act of reclaiming something he had corrupted. "You don't have to wear that specific dress," Tae Sung had said quietly, in the van, watching the small camera feed from a pin hidden near her collar as she checked her reflection one final time. "There's no operational reason for it." "There isn't," Wren agreed. "It's for me." He hadn't argued further, and something in the way he'd said good luck, quieter and rougher than his usual clipped professionalism, had stayed with her the entire elevator ride up. Seo Yul was, that final night, more relaxed than she had ever seen him, pouring wine with the easy confidence of a man who believed the world he had built for himself was still entirely intact, and Wren understood, watching him, that this relaxed, generous version of him had never once been real, that every warm gesture across 8 months had been the careful maintenance of a structure as artificial, and precisely engineered as the shell company hiding his stolen money. He complimented the dress without recognizing it, and something in that failure of recognition told her more clearly than any evidence file how little he had ever actually seen her at all, how the version of her he'd courted had been, in its own way, as constructed as the version of himself he'd presented in return. "To new beginnings," he said, raising his glass, and Wren raised hers and asked, in a voice she kept miraculously level, the question Young's team needed answered on record before they could move. "Whose money is actually funding the controlling stake, Yul? I want to know before I sign anything else." She let the smallest thread of genuine emotion into her voice. The accumulated exhaustion of 8 months finally permitted, just this once, to surface. "I need to know I'm not building something on a foundation I don't understand." Something in his easy expression flickered, a hairline crack in 9 years of careful practice. "You're asking a strange question for a woman about to become my partner in every sense of the word." "I'm asking because I deserve an honest answer, for once, from the man who's supposed to be building a future with me." "I've given you everything, Yul. My family's formulas, my name, 8 months of my life. I would like, just once, to know I gave it to someone real." The word real seemed to land somewhere Wren hadn't expected it to, and for one unguarded moment his careful composure wavered entirely, something almost like genuine grief crossing his face before he caught it and folded it away again, too late for it to matter, but not, Wren would think later, entirely performed either, the closest thing to an honest reaction she had ever seen cross his features. In 8 months. Whether it was her voice, or exhaustion, or the particular, fatal overconfidence that had undone every version of him in every previous city, Seo Yul finally, quietly, began to answer, laying out in careful, self-justifying language the architecture of funds moved and identities constructed, framing every fraud as simply the cost of survival in a world that had, he said, never once given a boy from a collapsed family in Incheon a fair chance to build anything honestly. He spoke of a father who had drunk away what little the family had, of a mother who worked 3 jobs and still couldn't keep the lights on some winters, of the particular, corrosive shame of watching wealthier boys at school mock the smell of instant noodles on his uniform. A shame he said he had spent 20 years methodically converting into other people's money instead of ever once addressing they. Wound itself. "I never wanted to hurt you," he said, and for one unsettling moment, his voice cracked with something that sounded horribly, almost sincere. "You were never supposed to be one of them, Wren. I told myself I could make this one real." "You don't get to decide which parts were real," Wren said, and her voice, though quiet, did not shake. "Not after this." That decision was never yours to make alone. It was, Tae Sung would say later, listening through the wire 2 floors below with his hands pressed flat against the console, the closest thing to a confession any of Young Ho-jae's previous victims had ever managed to extract, and it was enough, combined with 4 years of documented fraud, to end him completely. The officers moved the moment Young gave the signal, and Wren watched the man she had once believed loved her, taken from the room with a calm, almost surgical efficiency that felt, after 8 months of careful performance, like watching a held breath finally leave her body. He did not struggle. He looked back at her once, just before the elevator doors closed between them, and whatever expression crossed his face in that final moment, grief, calculation, some final flicker of the boy from Incheon he claimed to have buried under 20 years of invented names, Wren decided, standing very still in the emptying dining room that she was no longer obligated to spend any more of her life trying to interpret it. Tae Sung reached her less than a minute later, taking the stairs 2 at a time rather than waiting for the second elevator, and found her exactly where the officers had left her, still standing beside the table, the wire beneath her dress finally, blessedly silent. He didn't say anything at first, only crossed the room and pulled the small transmitter gently from beneath her collar, his hands careful, deliberate, the same precision he brought to everything before he finally spoke. "It's over," he said. "You did it." Every word he said, "We have it. I know." Wren looked down at the wine glass, still standing untouched where she'd set it, the gardenia-colored dress suddenly feeling less like reclamation and more, simply, like something she wanted to take off and never wear again. "Can we go somewhere that isn't this hotel?" "Anywhere you want," Tae Sung said, and meant it in a way that had nothing left to do with the case at all. Thank you for staying with Wren's story all the way to this moment. If this twist caught you off guard the way it caught her, take a second to like this video, drop a comment telling us where you first suspected something was wrong, and subscribe so you never miss the next unforgettable Afro-Korean thriller we bring you, because there is another story waiting for you right now. The weeks that followed brought their own quieter reckonings. Bianca Reyes was formally cleared once forensic analysis confirmed her laptop had, in fact, been accessed remotely. Part of a deliberate diversion Young Ho-jae had engineered specifically to draw suspicion away from himself should anyone begin looking too closely. A manipulation that left Wren furious on Bianca's behalf and freshly aware of exactly how many people's trust one carefully constructed man had been willing to spend to protect himself. Wren found her, the day the clearance came through, crying quietly in the shop's back office again, though this time from relief rather than fear, and sat with her for the better part of an hour, the two of them saying very little, understanding each other perfectly anyway. "I kept thinking I must have done something," Bianca admitted eventually, wiping her eyes. "Left something unlocked, made some mistake I couldn't remember making." "That's exactly what he wanted you to think," Wren said. "It's what he wanted me to think about myself, too, for 8 months. Men like that need someone else to carry the doubt so they never have to." She squeezed Bianca's hand. "You didn't do anything wrong. Neither did I. I need you to actually believe that, not just hear it." Chairman No, having narrowly avoided becoming Young Ho-jae's next casualty, quietly became one of Wren's earliest and most loyal legitimate investors instead, a partnership built, this time, on an audit trail so thorough it left no room for anything but genuine transparency between them. He insisted, with the same institutional caution that had once saved him, on structuring the new agreement so that Wren retained full control of her own formulas and her own board seat regardless of future capital raised, a term he explained simply as his own quiet apology for having once, even briefly, considered funding the man who nearly destroyed her. Dahlia Rhee, who had never once let herself say, "I told you so," in the weeks the investigation unfolded, finally allowed herself exactly 1 glass of wine's worth of vindication over dinner, and then spent the rest of the evening simply holding her friend's hand across the table, which was, Wren told her, worth infinitely more than being right. Han Tae Sung closed the file on Young Ho-jae, formerly Seo Yul, formerly 2 other names in 2 other countries, with the particular, hard-won satisfaction of a man who had spent a decade chasing a ghost that had finally, permanently, stopped moving, and found, to his own quiet astonishment, that the ending he had spent 10 years imagining felt smaller and stranger without his sister beside him to see it. A grief he carried into the months that followed with the same careful precision he brought to everything else, until Wren, who understood better than almost anyone what it cost to rebuild trust after watching it weaponized, gently, patiently, helped him learn to set some of that precision down. He flew to visit his sister the week the case formally closed, the first time in over a year he had made the trip without a case file in his bag as the reason for going, and told her, sitting across from her at the small kitchen table where he had once made his quiet promise to find the man responsible, that it was finally over, that the man who had taken everything from her friends would not be doing it to anyone else again. His sister had cried, and then, after a long moment, had asked him, with the first flicker of her old dry humor he'd heard from her in years, whether the woman he mentioned so carefully and so often in his updates about the case was someone she might eventually get to meet. Tae Sung had not had a ready answer for that either, though for entirely different, considerably happier reasons than the silence that had once undone him in Wren's flagship store. They did not rush what grew between them either. Both of them too experienced now in the particular damage of moving too fast toward a warmth that turned out to be constructed. Wren reopened the flagship store 2 months after the arrest, this time with Chairman No's transparent backing and a small brass plaque near the entrance bearing her grandmother's name, a detail she had not included in the original design and now considered non-negotiable. Dahlia stood beside her at the reopening with a glass of something considerably stronger than wine, and Bianca, promoted now to full store director, cried happy tears this time, the kind Wren had not seen from her since long before young Ho-jae's name had ever entered either of their lives. He took her, months later, to a small, unremarkable noodle shop near his old accounting firm with no river view at all, no rehearsed gestures, no flowers sent without a note, and told her, plainly, over bowls of broth that had nothing to do with impressing anyone, that he had spent a decade so afraid of being fooled again that he had nearly missed the one person who had never once asked him to pretend, to be anything other than exactly who he was. "I'm not good at this part," he admitted, turning his chopsticks over in his hands rather than meeting her eyes. "I've spent 10 years reading people for what they're hiding. I don't know how to just sit across from someone and not be looking for the lie." "Then don't look for one," Wren said. "Just sit with me." He looked up at that, something loosening in his shoulders that she hadn't realized had been held tight the entire meal, and for the first time since she'd met him, in an interview room that smelled like old carpet, she watched Han Tae Sung simply be still. Wren, sitting across from him in a shop that smelled of broth and steam instead of imported roses, understood, finally, the difference between a man who studies you to construct the version of himself you'll fall for, and a man who simply pays attention because he wants to know you. "I used to believe trusting the wrong man once meant I would spend the rest of my life doubting every kind gesture that came after, that my own judgment had been permanently, irreparably compromised the moment I let a carefully built lie feel like love. What I understand now is that the lesson was never to trust less. It was to trust more carefully, to ask the questions I was once too afraid of losing something to ask, and to recognize, finally, that real devotion rarely needs the theater the false kind always requires. There is a particular kind of grief in loving someone who never existed, a grief that has no funeral, no clean edge to grow around, only the slow work of learning which of your own memories to keep and which to set gently down. I have set most of them down now. What remains, oddly, is not bitterness, but a kind of gratitude for the friend who never stopped watching my back, for the investigator who saw me clearly before I saw myself, for a man who chased a ghost for a decade and, somewhere along the way, without either of us quite planning it, found something real instead. Somewhere between a boardroom built on stolen money and a noodle shop with no view at all, I found the difference, and I have never once mistaken it since.